Okay, so when you bring a bunch of curves into Cinema4D from something like Illustrator, quite often the curves appear in some odd place in your 3D scene. They're not nicely centered in the middle. If they are in the middle, fantastic, but quite often they're not. So what I want to talk about just very quickly is about groups in Cinema4D and hierarchies. So what Cinema4D does is it automatically takes the groupings from Illustrator and it applies curves often into subgroups. So we've got this master group, and then inside that are a bunch of groups, and if I zoom in a little bit closer here, if I open a group up, there's a path or a curve inside it. I'm not quite sure which one that is. There we go, there's some outlines. So what Cinema and Illustrator do between them is they organize the curves into all sorts of groups, and that can be a little confusing. What's even more confusing is every single group has its own position and scale and rotation. So if I close all these groups, and if I select this top level group here, I can move this entire group around, everything that's inside it. I can also open that group, select a subgroup, and move that group around. So each of these groups have their own handle or their own position, rotation, and scale values. So that can make things a little confusing. And we're going to probably run into that at various points through the project. The most important thing at the moment is just to be aware that that happens, that each group has its own position, scale, and rotation. What I'm going to do just by eye now to get this a little tidier in my scene before I start is I'm just going to manually grab this main group and I'm going to move it to the origin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize my perspective view using the little wee minimize button at the top right hand corner so I can see my front and side and top views. And I'm just going to zoom out on my front view and my top view. The front view is probably the most important one. And I'm just going to grab this logo by the top group and using my move tool, I'm just going to manually move it until it's at the origin of my 3D world. Now you should be able to see where the origin is. It's got slightly coloured axes. You can kind of see it in the perspective view. You get these red, green and blue little mini axes. And I just want my logo to be in the centre of my 3D world because when I start creating a bunch of other effects and generators, they're going to assume our graphics are at the centre of our 3D world. So I'm just going to grab that group and just by eye position it pretty much in the middle. Okay. Now this isn't super important, but it's a really convenient way of just setting up your scene and making life a little bit easier for yourself. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange the curves in my groups because I'm going to build this logo in a couple of different pieces. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a look through my groups here. What I want to do is I'm going to get rid of the square, the big square around the logo, and I want to make my letters 3D, and I want to make a couple of outlines. If I go back to my original movie file of the finished product, which is this one here, we can see at the end the letters are sticking out, they're slightly extruded. There's a black outline and a yellow outline at 3 different depths. So I want this as 3 separate objects, the text, the black outline, and the yellow outline. And I want to arrange these, the curves that make those up in Cinema so they're easy to build. So in Cinema, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first of all select these big squares around my logo. I don't want those at all, so I'm just going to select them and delete them. There's probably about 4 or 5 of them, I'm not exactly sure. Also, I'm not going to worry about the little registered trademark icon. If you zoom in a little closer, there's a little R inside a couple of circles. I'm going to delete those parts. Now, if you do that, one thing you might notice is there's a little black dot left over where that R used to be. That's the center of the group that they were in. And if we have a look over in our groups list, or our objects list, I can now see I've got a couple of empty groups. They've got nothing in them. That's because we've deleted all the objects out of the group. The group itself is an object and is still remaining in our scene. I don't need that anymore. I don't want it. It's just making a mess in my scene, so I'm just going to delete it. So as you're going through these groups and these curves, if you spot any groups that are left over, they won't have a little plus sign next to them. These are just empty groups. You want to get rid of those because they mess up your scene and they can get in the way a little further down the track. The other thing that I'm going to do now that I'm getting a little bit closer to the curves that I want is I'm going to name the important curves. So this big L curve here, if I click on it in my view, I can see the group that it is in has highlighted, it's changed colour slightly. So if I open that group up, there's a subgroup inside there. If I keep, whoops, I've deselected it. If I open that up, there we go. For me, path number 13 is the L. It might be something different for you, but I'm going to rename that because I want that and I want to be able to know what it is in my object list. So what I'm going to do quickly is go through and name the letters, and I'm also going to name the two outlines. I'll do the letters first. So I'm going to find, there's the E. For me, that's path 14. Let's just call that E. So just double click on the names to rename them. There's the G. Now the O is made of two curves, the inner curve and the outer one. So I'm going to name them O outer and O inner. Now, again, I don't know if your groups are the same as mine. On mine, the inner O curve is actually in a different group. It's not in the same group. I'm going to worry about that a little bit later on.
I'm not sure my logo is for you too.
Okay, I'll have a look at it in just a second. Okay, the next thing I want to do, I want two different outlines for my text. I'm going to take the closest outline to the curve, to the letters, so the inside outline. Once I've selected that, I can see it's in a group because the group's highlighted, and I'm going to call that outline inner, and I'm also going to use that outer outline, so I'm going to select it, find it in the groups and call that outline outer. Okay, that middle curve, there's actually three curves that outline. The middle one, I'm just going to delete that. I'm not going to use that one, so I'm just going to hit delete. Okay, so now I've got all my curves labelled. My groups are a little bit of a mess, so I'm going to tidy those up. So the way that we can arrange objects in groups is just to drag and drop them. In my groups here, for example, I've got a group that has most of the text letters in it, but it's missing the inner curve from the O. Now I've named that, so I know which one it is. I can just drag and drop that curve into that group. So now we've got all the text in one group. And that group, I'm going to call it text so that it makes sense. The other thing I've got with my text is that it's inside another group. I don't need it inside another group, so the text group, I'm just going to click and drag it out into a blank area in my object list, and that's just pulling it out of that other group. Now that group is left over, it's got nothing in it, so I'm going to delete it. Now all I've got is a group of text curves, and I've got two groups of outlines. I'm going to consolidate these. I'm going to put these together into one group to tidy it up. So let's drag and drop one of these curves into the other group and call that outlines. And now I've got a group left over with nothing in it. Let's get rid of that. My outlines group, let's pull that out. And then I've got the main group that it all came in with first of all. I'm going to get rid of that. So that's kind of a long, convoluted process, but basically all I've done is just tidied up the paths, the curves, the groups. I've named them all and arranged them in a logical way. So basically we're just cleaning up after Illustrator's import, which often makes a bit of a mess.